In the forests of Hokkaido, there is a photograph. An Ainu elder sits in a carved wooden chair, a heavy white beard spilling down the front of his robe. His face is deeply lined, his eyes set deeper than most people you will ever see from the Japanese archipelago. On his head sits a crown woven from dried grasses and bear fur, the mark of a ceremony the mainland Japanese state spent more than a century trying to erase. That elder was born into a world that officially claimed he did not exist. Not as a distinct people, not as a separate culture. The Japanese government wrote it into law. For 120 years, the state position was simple. These people were just primitive Japanese, a leftover barbarian branch of the same Yamato stock that built Tokyo. Ancient DNA has now proven that version of history was not just wrong. It was not slightly incomplete. It was structurally wrong. The Ainu are the direct descendants of an Ice Age people who arrived on those islands more than 30,000 years ago and never left. Their closest genetic relatives on the face of the earth are not the Japanese living a few hundred miles south of them. Their closest genetic relatives live across an ocean, on a different continent, in the indigenous nations of the Americas. Sit with that sentence for a moment, because everything you have ever been told about the origins of Japan is about to come undone. The version you probably learned goes something like this. The Japanese archipelago was settled in two major waves. First came the Jomon, a hunter-gatherer people who arrived tens of thousands of years ago and lived a simple, fishing and foraging existence for millennia. They made pottery, yes, but they never developed agriculture. Then, around 2,900 years ago, a second wave arrived from the Asian continent. These people brought wet rice farming, metal tools, and the political structures that would eventually become the Japanese imperial state. They were called the Yayoi. The Yayoi spread across the islands, absorbed the Jomon, or pushed them into remote corners, and from that mixture came the modern Japanese people. It was a clean, two-act story. Jomon in, Yayoi in, mixture happens, Japan emerges. The Ainu, in this telling, were simply a remnant pocket of those original Jomon who had not yet fully melted into the modern Japanese gene pool. A footnote, a curiosity, a people whose continued existence was an inconvenience to a modern nation-state that needed to believe it was one race, one people, one bloodline, from the emperor down to the smallest fishing village. It sounded coherent. It sounded reasonable. It was also, as the genetics would eventually reveal, badly incomplete. In 2015, a research team led by Genome published a study in the Journal of Human Genetics titled Unique Characteristics of the Ainu Population in Northern Japan. They did something no one had done with this level of precision before. They took genetic samples from living Ainu people and compared them systematically against populations from across Asia. The results were strange enough that they demanded explanation. The Ainu did not cluster with the mainland Japanese at all. They sat completely apart. Instead, their genetic profile leaned toward populations most people had never heard of, the Nivk of Sakhalin Island, a small Tungusic-speaking people who fish the cold waters north of Japan, the Itelmen of Kamchatka, an indigenous people of the Russian Far East, who hunted sea mammals and built semi-subterranean dwellings. These were hunter-gatherer peoples, not farmers, ancient lineages, not recent immigrants. The Ainu, Genome and colleagues concluded, had experienced a long, isolated history distinct from the rest of Japan. Their effective population size had been small for millennia. Genetic drift had shaped them into something unique on the planet. Let that sink in. A people living inside the borders of one of the most homogeneous-looking nations on Earth were genetically more similar to reindeer herders and seal hunters on the far northeastern edge of Siberia than to the people who shared their island chain. And that was only the beginning. Now bring in a second study, and this one changes the scale of the story entirely. In 2015, a team led by Raghavan published in the journal Science a paper called Genomic Evidence for the Pleistocene and Recent Population History of Native Americans. That study was focused on the peopling of the Americas, which on the surface has nothing to do with a minority group on a Japanese island, but buried inside its supplementary data, and then expanded in a 2019 Nature paper led by Sikora titled The Population History of Northeastern Siberia Since the Pleistocene, was a connection that should have made front-page news everywhere. Researchers identified an ancient population they called the Ancient Northeast Asians. These were people who lived in Siberia during the last ice age, 25,000 years ago and earlier, and the data showed something remarkable. The ancient Northeast Asians were a dividing point. One branch of this population gave rise to the Beringians, who crossed the land bridge into the Americas and became the ancestors of Native Americans. Another branch gave rise to the Jomon, which means the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Ainu of northern Japan share a common ancestor population that existed more than 25,000 years ago. They are, in a real genetic sense, distant cousins. The Ainu are not simply an outlying branch of Asian humanity. They are a window into one of the deepest subdivisions of the human family tree in Eastern Eurasia. If the story stopped here, it would already be powerful enough. But the studies kept coming. And then in 2019, a Japanese team pulled DNA from the bones of two people who had been buried in Hokkaido more than 3,500 years ago. Here is where the story turns in a way that textbooks are still struggling to catch up to. In 2019, Kanzawa Kiriyama and colleagues published in the journal Anthropological Science a study called Late Jomon Male and Female Genome Sequences from the Funadomori site in Hokkaido, Japan. They extracted DNA from two individuals buried at a site called Funadomori on Rebun Island just off the coast of Hokkaido. Those two people lived somewhere between 3,500 and 3,800 years before the present. They were Jomon, and their genomes were compared against modern populations across the planet. The results were unambiguous. The modern Ainu carry between 66 and 80% Jomon ancestry. Read that number again. 2/3 to 4/5 of the modern Ainu genome comes directly from a population that has been on the Japanese archipelago for more than 30,000 years. By contrast, the modern Yamato, the mainstream Japanese population, carry only 10 to 20% Jomon ancestry. The rest of what they carry comes from later continental migrants. The Ryukyuan people of Okinawa fall in between, roughly 30% Jomon. Stop and think about what that actually means. The majority population of Japan, the people who built the nation, the imperial line, the industrial economy, the modern state, are genetic newcomers. They are the product of a farming migration that arrived less than 3,000 years ago. But the Ainu, the people officially erased, officially assimilated, officially written out of the national family tree for more than a century, are what was there first. They carry the oldest continuous human lineage on the archipelago, not a footnote, the original text. And the studies kept coming. The 2019 Kanzawa Kiriyama paper did not just quantify the Ainu-Jomon connection. It pushed the divergence of the Jomon lineage back to a staggering depth of time. 30,000 to 38,000 years ago, the Jomon separated from other East Asian populations. Sit with that number for a second. 38,000 years ago, the last ancestors shared by the Jomon and the Han Chinese, or the Jomon and the Koreans, or the Jomon and any other East Asian group, split from one another and went separate ways. For the next 35,000 years, the Jomon lived on the Japanese archipelago in almost complete genetic isolation. They were not a branch of any known East Asian population. They were their own thing, a unique experiment in human adaptation that ran for longer than the entire history of agriculture, civilization, writing, and empire combined. But there was one more study coming, and it would overturn even the two-wave model that the Kanzawa Kiriyama paper seemed to confirm. In 2021, a team led by Cook and Nakagome published in the journal Science Advances a study that reshaped the entire field. The title was Ancient Genomics Reveals Tripartite Origins of Japanese Populations. Tripartite, 3 parts. The team sequenced 12 ancient Japanese genomes spanning 8,000 years. And what they found demolished the clean structure that had governed Japanese prehistory for decades. There were not 2 waves of migration. There were 3. The first was the Jomon, who arrived more than 30,000 years ago and formed the deepest layer. The second was the Yayoi, continental East Asian farmers who arrived roughly 2,900 years ago from what is now the Korean peninsula and introduced wet rice agriculture. And then, around 1,400 years ago, during a period known as the Kofun, a third wave arrived from East Asia. This third wave was tied to state formation. It was tied to the consolidation of what would become the Japanese imperial structure, the Yamato state, the court, the first emperor. The entire political edifice that would eventually claim a single, unbroken, homogeneous Japanese identity was itself built on a new migration that arrived after the Jomon and after the Yayoi. Modern Japanese are not a simple 2-part mixture. They are a 3-layer stack. Jomon at the bottom, Yayoi in the middle, Kofun at the top, and the Ainu? The Ainu are the bottom layer, preserved, the deepest ancestry on the islands, still breathing. That tripartite finding did more than add a third wave to Japanese prehistory. It changed what the word Japanese itself can mean. The Japanese state spent the modern era cultivating an ideology of a single Yamato race descended from the sun goddess, unified by blood, language, and spirit. That ideology was not ancient. It was a Meiji-era construction, built in the late 19th century to forge a modern nation-state out of what had been a fragmented, regionally varied archipelago. The genetics show that the real history is the opposite of that myth. Japan has never been homogeneous. It has been layered, punctuated, restructured by successive migrations whose living descendants are distributed unevenly across the islands today. Some families carry more Jomon, some carry more Yayoi, some carry more Kofun. The Ainu and the Ryukyuan people carry the deepest layers. The majority population carries the most recent. All of them together make up what the world calls Japanese. Not one people. A stack of peoples, and the deepest part of the stack is still there, in the north, still performing bear ceremonies, still speaking a language that has no known relatives anywhere on Earth. Now take a breath, because if you have made it this far, tap subscribe. The next part goes deeper than the textbooks ever allowed, and it connects this story across an ocean to a continent the Japanese state never even considered. Now go back to the source of this story. Do not think of it as a percentage in a paper. Think of it as a place, a time, a way of living that lasted longer than almost any other human culture on Earth. Try to imagine standing on a beach on Hokkaido 10,000 years ago, before the Yayoi existed, before rice had ever touched the archipelago, before the first metal tool had ever been forged anywhere in the islands. The water is cold. The forest behind you stretches dark to the mountains. A settlement of perhaps 20 or 30 people sits on a rise above the tide line. They are not farmers. They never became farmers. For millennia, they lived by taking what the forest and the sea offered them. Salmon in the rivers, deer in the hills, shellfish along the shore, chestnuts and acorns gathered in autumn, and they made pottery. This detail matters more than most people realize. The Jomon were making fired clay pots 16,500 years ago. That is older than any pottery from the Middle East, older than any pottery from Europe. In a world where the invention of ceramics is usually tied to agriculture and settled village life, the Jomon did it as hunter-gatherers. They made the oldest pots on Earth, and they did it before they planted a single seed. Picture that, a people living in a world of mammoths and giant deer, and they are already crafting fired clay vessels with elaborate cord-marked patterns. The word Jomon itself means cord marking, named for those rope impressions pressed into the wet clay. At their peak, around 6,000 years ago, the Jomon population of the Japanese archipelago reached roughly 260,000 people. For comparison, the entire world population at that time was only around 5 to 7 million. The Jomon were not a marginal, isolated handful of survivors. They were one of the largest concentrations of hunter-gatherers anywhere on the planet. A civilization without cities, without kings, without armies, and without agriculture, lasting longer than every empire that has ever risen and fallen since. And then, 2,900 years ago, the first rice farmers crossed the strait from the Korean peninsula. The Yayoi had arrived. This is where the old story says the Jomon were absorbed or eliminated. But the old story has the timeline wrong. The Jomon did not disappear when the Yayoi arrived. They did not vanish in a single wave of conquest. For hundreds of years, the two populations coexisted, intermarried unevenly, and carved the archipelago into zones of mixture and zones of separation. In the west and center of Honshu, the Yayoi population was denser, the farming more productive, the political consolidation faster. But the further north you went, the thinner the Yayoi presence became. And in Hokkaido, the far north, the Yayoi never truly arrived at all. Hokkaido remained Jomon country long after the rest of Japan had transformed. The Jomon up there simply continued, generation after generation, still hunting, still fishing, still making their cord-marked pots, still performing ceremonies that connected the living to the spirits of the forest and the sea. The modern Ainu descend directly from those northern Jomon. They are not a population that retreated from the Yayoi. They are a population that never left their own land, because they were never displaced in the way the southern Jomon were. They stayed, and the world moved in around them. But there is something even broader hiding in this data, and it has to do with the shape of the human family tree itself. If your family carries roots from anywhere in East Asia, from Tokyo to Seoul to Shanghai, the specific mixture in your DNA right now reflects a history unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. For tens of thousands of years, the eastern edge of Asia was not a unified genetic landscape. It was a mosaic. Different early lineages evolved in isolation from one another, diverging at depths of time that most populations elsewhere on Earth never experienced. The Jomon were one of those early lineages, and for 35 millennia they stayed separate. When the Yayoi and Kofun migrations finally crossed into the archipelago, they did not replace that deep layer. They added to it. Every modern Japanese person alive today carries some Jomon DNA, some trace of the people who made the oldest pottery on Earth, whether they know it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not. The difference between the Ainu and the Yamato is not a difference of kind. It is a difference of proportion. The Ainu carry the majority. The Yamato carry a minority. But both carry it. The oldest layer is inside everyone on those islands. Now here is where the story breaks out of Japan entirely. And this is the moment the researchers themselves did not fully anticipate. In 2019, the Sakura team published their massive study on Siberian population history in Nature, and in it, they made explicit what had been building in the data for years. The population they called ancient Northeast Asians was ancestral to both the Jomon and the Beringians. The Beringians are the people who lived on the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska before the ice melted. The people who eventually crossed into the Americas and became the ancestors of every indigenous nation on 2 continents. Which means the Ainu and Native Americans share a common ancestral population that lived in northeastern Siberia before the Ice Age ended. They split from one another somewhere around 25,000 years ago, one group heading east into the Americas, the other heading south into Japan. That is not a metaphor. That is not a spiritual connection. That is a measured, peer-reviewed, replicated genetic finding. And now think about what that means. The Ainu of Japan, the people who still live in the forests of Hokkaido, are among the closest living relatives of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Not as close as, say, the modern populations of Siberia who share more recent ancestry with Native Americans, but closer than any population in China, Korea, or mainland Japan. If you are a viewer descended from Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest, from the Salish, or the Haida, or the Tlingit, portions of your genome share deep ancestry with the Ainu. Some of the oldest lineages in your DNA trace back to the same founders who gave rise to the people still living at the northern edge of Japan. That finding reframes what an ocean is. The Pacific has always been a barrier, but before it was a barrier, it was a highway of ice and tundra, and the people who crossed it left descendants on both sides. The Ainu on one shore, the First Nations of the Americas on the other. Cousins separated by 25,000 years and the largest ocean on the planet. Go ahead and sit with what that means. You should. And that, in turn, raises a question the old story never even thought to ask. Who precisely were the ancient Northeast Asians? The source notes do not give them a flag or a nation or a language. What they give is a position in the human family tree. These were one of the foundational populations of Eastern Eurasia, ancestral to multiple later groups. And they existed at a time when the world was dramatically different. 25,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower. Hokkaido was not an island. It was connected to the mainland by dry land. Hokkaido and Sakhalin in the Siberian coast formed a continuous landscape. The ancestors of the Jomon walked into what is now Japan. The ancestors of the Beringians walked into what is now the Americas. Both journeys began in the same cold forests. That shared beginning is now written into the genomes of their modern descendants. It is written into the Ainu. It is written into the Native Americans. And until 2015, no one had ever proven it with the kind of precision that now exists. The old story said the Ainu were an isolated, anomalous group with no known relatives. The new data says the opposite. The Ainu are connected to one of the largest, most consequential human dispersals in the history of the species. They are not isolated. They are upstream. But the Ainu are not just a genetic fact. They are a living people with a specific history of pain, and if this story skipped over that pain, it would be incomplete. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. The new Japanese state was building a modern empire. It needed a frontier. It needed resources. It needed a place to plant settlers and secure the northern border against Russia. So in 1869, the state annexed the Ainu homeland and renamed it. The old name had meant Land of the Humans. The new name was Hokkaido, meaning Northern Sea Road. That act of renaming was itself an erasure. The renaming of a place is the first step in erasing the people who named it. Then came the law. In 1899, the Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act passed. That was the official title, Former Aborigines. The law declared that the Ainu were no longer a separate people, that their languages and customs were relics that had to be abandoned. It banned Ainu language in schools. It forced the Ainu to abandon hunting and fishing, the basis of their subsistence economy for thousands of years. It compelled them to adopt farming, to take Japanese names, to assimilate. The law did not provide them land. It gave them tiny plots of marginal soil and called it charity. It did not protect them, it regulated them out of existence. Ainu women were forbidden to practice the traditional mouth tattoos that marked their cultural identity. Ainu men were forbidden to perform the bear ceremony. Ainu children were beaten in school for speaking their own language. By the 1870s, there were roughly 26,000 Ainu. By the end of the 20th century, fewer than half that number were officially registered, and even that count is misleading, because generations of Ainu descendants learned to hide their ancestry to escape discrimination. They changed their family registers. They moved to the cities and passed as ordinary Japanese. They carried the trauma and the history inside them and never spoke of it. The state had spent a century telling them they did not exist, and eventually, many of them started to believe it. The same pattern repeated in Okinawa. If your family carries roots from the Ryukyu Islands, some version of this history is sitting in your genome right now. The Ryukyuan people carry roughly 30% Jomon ancestry. They maintained a thriving independent kingdom for centuries, trading with China and Southeast Asia, building stone castles, cultivating their own language and religion and music. Then Japan annexed them in the 1870s too, and imposed the same assimilation policies. Same script, same erasure, same denial of difference in the name of national unity. The larger Japanese identity was built on suppressing two indigenous populations. That is not editorializing. That is the historical record, now confirmed at the genetic level. The Ainu and the Ryukyuan people both descend from the deep Jomon layer. The state called them former Aborigines and wrote them out of the national story. The DNA has written them back in. Let that sink in for a moment. The two groups the Japanese state worked hardest to erase from history are the two groups carrying the deepest ancestry the islands have to offer. The official story said they were latecomers, barbarians, marginal remnants. The genetic story says they are the original. The official story said the modern Japanese are the original people of the islands. The genetic story says the modern Japanese are the most recently arrived. The entire hierarchy has been inverted by a set of sterile, peer-reviewed measurements taken from ancient bones and living cheeks. If you are feeling a strange mix of anger and awe right now, you are not alone. That mixture is what this history produces. But there are caveats, and the science is honest about them. Modern Ainu are not pure Jomon. No one is. The 66 to 80% figure leaves room for a substantial minority of non-Jomon ancestry. That additional ancestry comes from centuries of mixture with the mainland Japanese, through trade, through intermarriage that was sometimes voluntary and sometimes coerced, through the modern era in which Ainu descendants,